The Story of Civilization, Part 2, Life of Greece, being a history of Greek civilization from the beginnings and of civilization in the Near East, from the death of Alexander to the Roman conquest, with an introduction on the prehistoric culture of Crete by Durant. Chapter 7, The Greeks in the West, Part 2, Pythagoras of Crotona. Crotona lasted longer, founded about 710 BCE. It is, as Crotone, still noisy with industry and trade. It had the only natural harbor between Taras and Sicily, and could not forgive those ships that discharged their cargoes at Sybaris. Enough trade remained to give the citizens a comfortable prosperity, while a wholesome defeat in war, a long economic depression, a brisk climate, and a certain Dorico-Puritan mode in the population conspired to keep them vigorous despite their wealth. Here grew famous athletes like Milo, and the greatest school of medicine in Magna Graecia, the name given by the Romans to the Greek cities in southern Italy. And remember that in Latin, if you see a C, you pronounce it as a K. Perhaps it was its reputation as a health resort that drew Pythagoras to Crotona. The name means mouthpiece of the Pythian oracle at Delphi. Many of his followers considered him to be Apollo himself, and some laid claim to having caught a flash of his golden thigh. Tradition assigned his birth to Samos about 580 BCE, spoke of his studious youth, and gave him 30 years of travel. Of all men, says Heraclitus, who praised persimoniously, Pythagoras was the most assiduous inquirer. He visited, we are told, Arabia, Syria, Phoenicia, Chaldea, India, and Gaul, and came back with an admirable motto for tourists: when you are traveling abroad, look not back at your own borders. Prejudices should be checked at every port of entry. More surely he visited Egypt, where he studied with the priests and learned much astronomy and geometry, and perhaps a little nonsense. Returning to Samos and finding that the dictatorship of Polycrates interfered with his own, he migrated to Crotona, being now over 50 years of age. And Magna Graecia was what the Romans called it. Well, they called the Greek cities in the region that. There he set up as a teacher, and his imposing precedence, his varied learning, and his willingness to receive women as well as men into his school soon brought him several hundred students. Presence was the word I was looking for. Not precedence, but same thing. Both fit in the context. 2 centuries before Plato, he laid down the principle of equal opportunity for both sexes, and did not merely preach it, but practiced it. Nevertheless, he recognized natural differences of function. He gave his women pupils considerable training in philosophy and literature, but he had them instructed as well in maternal and domestic arts, so that the Pythagorean women were honored by antiquity as the highest feminine type that Greece ever produced. For these students, in general, Pythagoras established rules that almost turned the school into a monastery. The members bound themselves by a vow of loyalty, both to the master and to one another. Ancient tradition is unanimous that they practice a communistic share of goods while they lived in the Pythagorean community, they were not to eat flesh, or eggs, or beans. Wine was not forbidden, but water was recommended, a dangerous prescription in Lower Italy today. Possibly, the prohibition of flesh food was a religious taboo bound up with the belief in the transmigration of souls. Men must beware of eating their ancestors. Probably there were dispensations now and then from the letter of those rules. English historians in particular find it incredible that the wrestler Milo, who was a Pythagorean, had become the strongest man in Greece without the help of beef, though the calf that became a bull in his arms managed well enough on grass. And beef is not the best source of protein. Don't you use just as much protein from eating peanut butter as eating beef? And there are some other examples. And you can get a balanced protein without eating beef or even fish. See chapter 9, section 4. Okay, so these parts are called sections, and then the parts would be the ones with the regular numbers. The members were forbidden to kill any animal that does not injure man, or to destroy a cultivated tree. They were to dress simply and behave modestly, never yielding to laughter, and yet not looking stern. They were not to swear by the gods, for every ought to so live as to be worthy of belief without an oath. And that goes kind of both ways. You don't have people swear to things just to have them swear to things. They were not to offer victims as sacrifice, but they might worship at altars that were unstained with blood. At the close of each day, they were to ask themselves what wrongs they had committed, what duties they had neglected, and what good they had done. The muhasabah practiced by the Sufis has some similarities to that. Pythagoras himself, unless he was an excellent actor, followed these rules most rigorously, more than any student. Certainly his mode of life won for him such respect and authority among his pupils that no one grumbled at his pedagogical dictatorship, and autos epa ipse dixit, he himself has said it, became their formula for a final decision in almost any field of conduct or theory. Well, if you have a prophet, you would adapt that too. If you actually had a prophet of divinity, what's been revealed to them, what's been inspired through them, that would be the kind of word, right? We are told with touching reverence that the master never drank wine by day and lived for the most part on bread and honey with vegetables as dessert. Not lots of fruit as dessert, but that his robe was always white and spotless, that he was never known to eat too much or to make love. We need to distinguish between making love and having sex, though, but I don't think that's what they mean. That he never indulged in laughter or jests or stories, that he never chastised anyone, not even a slave. Timon of Athens thought him a juggler of solemn speech, engaged in fishing for men. Notice the parallel with the Bible and the Jesus thing, fishers of men and all that. It may not have been flattering speech, but among his most devoted followers were his wife Theano and his daughter Damo, who had facilities for comparing his philosophy with his life. To Damo, says Diogenes Laertius, he entrusted his commentaries and charged her to divulge them to no person out of the house. And she, though she might have sold his discourses for much money, would not abandon them, for she thought obedience to her father's injunctions more valuable than gold, and that too, though she was a woman. Ultimately, it shouldn't matter what gender people are with all this, but, initiation into the Pythagorean society required, in addition to purification of the body by abstinence and self-control, a purification of the mind by scientific study. The new pupil was expected to preserve for 5 years the Pythagorean silence, presumably to accept instructions without question or argument before being accounted a full member, are being permitted to see, perhaps study under Pythagoras. The scholars were accordingly divided into exoterici, or outer students, and esoterici, are inner members, who were entitled to the secret wisdom of the master himself. 4 subjects composed the curriculum: geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. Mathematics came first. The Pythagoreans appear to have been the first to use the word mathematica with the meaning of mathematics. Before them, it had been applied to learning, mathema, of anything, not as the practical science that the Egyptians made it, but as an abstract theory of quantities and an ideological training in which thinking would be compelled in order and clarity by the test of rigorous deduction and visible proof. Geometry now definitely received the form of the axiom, the theorem, and demonstration. At each step in the sequence of propositions raised the student to a new platform, as the Pythagoreans put it, from which he might view more widely the secret structure of the world. Pythagoras himself, according to Greek tradition, discovered many theorems, above all that the sum of the angles within any triangle equals 2 right angles, and that the square of the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle equals the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides. Pythagoras tells us that when the master discovered this theorem, he sacrificed a hecatomb, 100 animals, in thanksgiving, but this would have been scandalously un-Pythagorean. Well, I don't know about how scandalously it would have been. If we look at perhaps the context of the animal sacrifices and stuff in the Hindu tradition, it wasn't that meat was forbidden, it was that meat was forbidden as a secular thing. Because, you know, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Puranas, the Slokas, and the Shrutis all actually command animal sacrifice, but they don't. They, in parts, seem to condemn the mere meat eating. So that's what you need to look at, mere, and see, maybe he didn't have sex merely to have sex. So that was what set him apart. Who knows? Pythagoras could have actually been married, but we don't have that information. But, you know, if one looks at it from that angle. From geometry, inverting the modern order, Pythagoras passed to arithmetic, not as a practical part of reckoning, but as the abstract theory of numbers. Well, if you know numbers, you know, proportions and shapes and all that sort of stuff, you can tell fake from real. The best of artists, at least the ones without using the AI, you can tell the difference between what they're painting and actual lower grade photographs. The school seems to have made the first classification of numbers into odd or even, prime or factorable. It formulated the theory of proportion, and through this, the application of areas created a geometrical algebra. Perhaps it was the study of proportion that led Pythagoras to reduce music to number. One day, as he passed a blacksmith's shop, his ear was attracted by the apparently regular musical intervals of the sounds that came from the anvil. And, you know, that, of course, reminds one of the story of Rumi and his connecting such things to remembrance of God. Finding that the hammers were of different weights, he concluded that the tones depended upon numerical ratios. One of the few experiments which we hear of in classical science, he took 2 strings of equal thickness and equal tension and discovered that if one was twice as long as the other, they sounded an octave when he plucked them. If one was half again the length of the other, they gave a fifth. Do so. If one was a third longer by the other, they gave a fourth, do, fa. In this way, every musical interval could be mathematically calculated and expressed, since all bodies moving in space produce sounds whose pitch depends upon the size and speed of the body, and each planet in its orbit about the Earth, argued Pythagoras, makes a sound proportioned to its rapidity of translation, which in turn rises with its dissonance from the Earth, and these diverse notes constitute a harmony, or music of the spheres, which we never hear because we hear it all the time. And yeah, there's so many sounds and sensations and all sorts of stuff going on that we can shift our focus back and forth. Why do you think one of the definitions of magic is the willful shifting of consciousness? The universe, says Pythagoras, is a living sphere whose center is the Earth. The Earth, too, is a sphere, revolving like planets from west to east. The Earth, indeed, the whole universe is divided into 5 zones: Arctic, Antarctic, summer, winter, and equatorial. More or less of the moon is visible to us according to the degree in which that half of it, which is facing the sun, is also turned towards the Earth. Eclipses of the moon are caused by the interposition of the Earth or some other body between the moon and the sun. Pythagoras says Diogenes Laertius was the first person to call the Earth round and to give the name of cosmos to the world. Having, with those contributions to mathematics and astronomy, done more than any other man to establish science in Europe, Pythagoras proceeded to philosophy. The varying word is apparently one of his creations. He rejected the term Sophia, or wisdom, as pretentious, and described his own pursuit of understanding as Philosophia, the love of wisdom. In the 6th century, philosopher and Pythagorean were synonymous, whereas they were synonyms. All these weeks of smoke smell in the air. Changing, right? Whereas Thales and the other Milesians had sought the first principle of all things in matter, Pythagoras sought it in form, having discovered numerically regular relations and sequences in music, and having postulated them in the planets, he made the philosophers leap at unity by announcing that such numerically regular relations and sequences existed everywhere, and that the essential factor in everything was number, just as Spinoza would argue on the improvement of the intellect, that there were 2 worlds, one the people's world of things perceived by sense, the other the philosopher's world of laws and constancies perceived by reason, and that only the second world was permanently real. So Pythagoras felt that the only basic and lasting aspects of anything were the numerical relationships of its parts. Science tries to reduce all phenomena to quantitative, mathematical, verifiable statements. Well, science is the facts. It's not the same thing as, he means philosophy of science, really. Chemistry describes all things in terms of symbols and figures, arranges the elements mathematically in a periodic law, and reduces them to an intra-atomic arithmetic of electrons. Astronomy becomes celestial mathematics, and physics seek a mathematical formula to cover the phenomena of electricity, magnetism, and gravitation. Some thinkers of our time have tried to express philosophy itself in mathematical form. Perhaps health was a proper mathematical relationship or proportion in the parts or elements of the body. Perhaps even the soul was number. At this point, the mysticism in Pythagoras, nurtured in Egypt, Agaptas, I believe is how you pronounce it, and at the Near East, disported itself freely. The soul, he believed, is divided into 3 parts: feeling, intuition and reason. Feeling is centered in the heart, intuition and reason in the brain. Feeling and intuition belong to animals as well as men. We should note in passing that Pythagoras, slightly anticipating Pasteur, denied spontaneous generation and taught that all animals are born from other animals through seeds, and as the Greek term sperma, is that the right word? Or it means something else? Reason belongs to man alone and is immortal. After death, the soul undergoes a period of purgation in Hades, and then it returns to earth and enters a new body in a chain of transmigration that can be ended only by a completely virtuous life. Now, the idea of reincarnation is very physical. Who knows how many creatures we share ancestry with in terms of our physical bodies. Pythagoras amused, or perhaps edified, his followers by telling them that he had been, in one incarnation, a courtesan, in another, the hero Euphorbus. He could remember quite distinctly his adventures at the siege of Troy, and recognized in a temple at Argos the armor that he had worn in that ancient life. Hearing the yelp of a beaten dog, he went at once to the rescue of the animal, saying that he distinguished in its cries the voice of a dead friend. We catch again a glimpse of the trade in ideas that bound 6th century Greece, Africa, and Asia, when we reflect that this idea of metempsychosis was at one and the same time capturing the imagination of India, of the Orphic cult in Greece, and of a philosophic school in Italy. Now remember, the people that we call Yazidi, from the Western term, they believed in reincarnation clearly 12,000 years ago, so more like 12,500 years ago, something like that, but and perhaps longer than that. So the snake cult, Greece, okay. We feel the hot breath of Hindu pessimism mingling in the ethics of Pythagoras with the clear, bright air of Plato. I don't remember how to spell it in Greek, so. The purpose of life in the Pythagorean system is to gain release from reincarnation. The method is through virtue, and virtue is a harmony of the soul within itself and with God. Sometimes this harmony can be artificially induced, and the Pythagoreans, like Greek priests and doctors, use music to heal nervous disorders. More often, harmony comes to the soul through wisdom, a quiet understanding of underlying truths. For such wisdom reaches a man modesty, measure, and the golden mean, the opposite way of discord, excess, and sin, leads by inevitable fate to tragedy and punishment. Justice is a square number, and sooner or later every wrong will be squared with an equivalent penalty. Here in germ are the moral philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. Pythagorean politics is Plato's philosophy realized before its conception. According to the common tradition of antiquity, the school of Pythagoras was a communistic aristocracy, men and women pooling their goods, educated together, trained to virtue and high thinking by mathematics, music, and philosophy, and offering themselves as the guardian rulers of the state. Indeed, it was Pythagoras' effort to make his society the actual government of his city that brought ruin upon himself and his followers. The initiates entered so actively in politics and took so decidedly the aristocratic side that the Democratic or Popular Party of Crotona, in an ecstasy of rage, burned down the house in which the Pythagoreans were gathered, killed several of them, and drove the rest out of the city. Pythagoras himself, in one account, was captured and slain when in his flight he refused to tread upon a field of beans. Another story lets him escape to Metapontum, where he abstained from food for 40 days, and perhaps feeling that 80 years were enough, starved himself to death. So at what point during those 40 days did he starve to death? Now, a lot of fasting is not 24-hour fast, or it's some sort of partial thing where you drink water or otherwise torture your body. And actually, you can die quicker doing a water fast than you can through others. But, regard healthy practices and just don't fast because, it's religious people did it before. But most things you can, fast 30 days straight. The days, dawn to sunset, His influence was lasting. Even today, he is a potent name. His society survived for 3 centuries in scattered groups throughout Greece, producing scientists like Philolaus, Thebes, and statesmen like Archytas, dictator of Taras and friend of Plato. Wordsworth, in his most famous ode, was an unconscious Pythagorean. Plato himself was enthralled by the vague figure of Pythagoras. At every turn he takes from him, in his scorn of democracy, his yearning for a communistic aristocracy of philosopher rulers, his conception of virtue as harmony, his theories of the nature and destiny of the soul, his love of geometry, and his addiction to the mysticism of number. All in all, Pythagoras was the founder, so far as we know them, of both science and philosophy in Europe, an achievement sufficient for any man. Now, I would question whether or not here that biblical Christianity is in part Pythagorean, because it seems like that's the one type of philosophy that it kind of left out.